Edison students. Miss Sullivan here. What we're going to look at in this little mini Nearpod is energy in terms of heat. So heat can be transferred in three ways. So heat can be transferred in three ways. So we're going to list those ways in just a minute. But anyway, what is heat to begin with? Heat is the transfer of thermal energy. So heat is the transfer of thermal energy. Okay. And as such, an object cannot possess heat but can transfer it to or receive it from its surroundings. Just because two objects are in contact might reach what we studied, thermal equilibrium, does not mean that the temperature is exactly in the middle. So when you guys were heating up the water with rocks, the final temperature of equilibrium wasn't necessarily right between the temperature of the water and the rock. But heat is the transfer of thermal energy, and heat can be transferred in three ways. So let's take a look in way one. Method one is by conduction. So conduction. And in conduction, you transfer heat through direct contact. So you can take notes at home to help you remember this information. I'm going to switch to blue. The second way that we can transfer heat is through convection. And I'm going to show you some examples of each of these ways in the next slides that follow. So we have convection. And so convection is the transfer of heat by a fluid warming up and rising. Okay, so we're going to take notes just like we do in class of some key ideas. All right, the third way that heat can be transferred is through radiation. Okay, radiation. And that is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic, that's a C on the end, that's a C, you can't really see the C, but through electromagnetic waves. All right, so you guys are going to be making for me a little flip grid where you guys are going to have an opportunity to show me an example of either conduction, convection, or radiation. Should be a fun little project. So one thing I want you guys to be aware of is that heat is always moving. If you have two objects or substances that are at different temperatures, heat will always move out of the warmer object or substance and into the cooler object or substance. I had you do an HMH solvent lab where you had cream and coffee. And you also had rocks and water. And let's just think for a minute about the transfer of energy in that lab. So hot coffee, cold cream, the heat was going from the coffee to the cream. It's going from the hotter object to the cooler object. With rocks and water, you guys heated up the rocks on the fireplace. And so the rocks were hotter and the water was cooler, and you were going to heat up the water. And so heat went from the hotter rocks to the cooler water. And that's always the case. So if you look up here, you see that the direction of flow of heat transfer is always from the warmer object to the cooler object. And so this happens in 3 different ways that we transfer heat. And so you're going to be making a little video for me showing me an example of at least one place. You can find things in your home. Be creative. You'll get some points for your ideas when I grade your Flipgrids. But you're going to give me an example. So you guys could do coffee and creamer or water and rocks, but you get some points for creativity if you come up with your own ideas. All right, so let's take a look now at this next slide. Both of these pictures depict what kind of heat transfer. So there's 3 methods that we transfer heat. We have conduction, convection, or radiation. So if you ever stepped on hot sand, you know that the hot sand is hotter, and so some of the heat transfers from the hot sand to your feet. When that happens, this is an example of conduction. So if you guessed that that was conduction, you are right. And conduction, it's easy to spot. So when you're looking for examples in your home, conduction happens when you have direct contact with objects. Direct contact with objects. And so here's a classic example with food preparation. The hot burner touches the pan. The hot burner is hotter than the pan. The hot burner uses conduction to heat the pan, and then the food is typically colder than the pan, and then the heat transfers from the hotter pan to the even cooler food. So here's a classic example of conduction. Now let's take a look at another situation. This next example is going to be for convection. And so if you can imagine a pot here of soup, here's a pot of soup, and here's the burner down below. This is very hot. And so what happens is initially the fluids at the bottom of the pan are cold. As they heat up, the molecules spread apart and it becomes less dense. As the soup that's down here at the bottom becomes less dense, it becomes lighter, the molecules spread apart, and it moves to the top. And as it moves to the top, eventually the soup at the top of the pan, it starts to condense again, it cools off, and the molecules move closer together, and then that soup that's cooler tends to move back down. These are called convection currents. And when you have these kind of movement of a fluid moving up when it's hotter and then back down when it's cooler, that process is called convection. That can happen with our air, or it could happen perhaps with a pot of soup. Another natural example of convection currents is wind. As the sun shines down on an area of land, it heats the air right above the ground. So this area right here is becoming hotter, and hot, the molecules get more energy and they spread out and they become more dense and lighter, and those air molecules rise up. And as it rises, cooler air moves in to take the place at the bottom. So what happens is now this warmer air rises and some of new air comes in, and then it'll be heated eventually by the Earth's surface and the sun as well. But you can see that what you see is this moving cooler air creates what we call wind. So there are lots of examples of conduction and convection, and now we're going to look at another example of how heat moves on the next slide. So these are examples of what? The sun heats the earth, or if you're sitting by a campfire, your hands are warmed by the campfire. What kind of heat transfer is this? Well, it's that third type. This is radiation. This is radiation. So with radiation, radiation is how heat moves when there are no molecules. So there's no direct contact. There's no molecules. There's no fluid. So there's no molecules when we're talking about radiation. Radiation is heat moving in waves. So radiation is heat moving in waves. Radiation does not need molecules to pass energy along.